I am live, and it is now time for Worldbuilding Wednesday, where we're going to start and talk about lots of different aspects of making a world. As always, we've got our document open, and we'll be digging into various aspects of a setting. We've already built out some elements of two different settings, which we'll be adding to today. And today we've got two different topics I want to talk about, somewhat related: geography and the nature of a settlement. Now, with geography, obviously I'm talking about geography, the physical layout of the environment: mountainous, forest, jungles, etc. This is also a good point for me to mention that there are lots of different ways of doing this, meaning I'm going in a particular order with these elements, but you may start in a different order. I have found that this order is more useful than just going in a random order. In other words, this is intentional. But you might start with geography first. You might have an idea for the size of your continent and the scale of things, and you can start there. That's totally fine. The reason I've left geography towards later is because I think geography is not necessarily as important as things like food and the other things we've covered in this so far. Let's talk about geography then. What is the geography of your environment? And let's start typing here. So first we have the question of geography. And at the very beginning you can start asking, okay, what is the planet like? Assuming you're on a planet of some kind. You're not going too fantastical. Is it a small planet? Is it a large planet? Is it a water world, etc.? In science fiction, we tend to have worlds with only one biome, so an icy planet, a desert planet, etc. That's not really, it doesn't seem to be particularly accurate about life-sustaining planets, but that's a thing to think about, and that is a way of orienting your society. And again, this is going to be fantasy, so you can certainly go there. But those fundamentals will impact your setting if you want to go wild. Dune being the canonical example, where the hot desert environment shapes the people, shapes the situations of the story. So again, how bizarre do you want that to go? And then you have the question of what is civilized, what is not civilized, but what is inhabited land like, right? So with the places where people live, what does that look like? You may have a very inhospitable planet, but a relatively lush area where people live. And you want to start kind of defining that. And then what are its boundaries? We tend to bound our lands by water, rivers, oceans, etc. And that's a very natural, very reasonable boundary. But you may have underwater people, right? You may have people who fly, and where that just doesn't make sense as much. All right, so there's that. You also want to think about what is the geology. In other words, rocks, soil, and water, etc. So, do you have a land that is easily mineable, a land that supports agriculture easily or more difficulty, or certain kinds of agriculture? So we mentioned this before. Japan, geographically, is a very mountainous country, but is also a very verdant country. It has a lot of rain. This means it's ideal for rice cultivation, not so much barley and wheat and corn and things along those lines. There are certain areas where those crops will flourish, but rice is much easier to plant in much larger areas than those other kinds of of staples, so that influences that culture because rice is cultivated in a particular way, grows a particular way. And similarly, because rice tends to grow in pockets, you don't have, you have these rice paddies as opposed to vast fields. That changes how people think about farming and think about property, right? You have these smaller units as opposed to these large units of fields. In a mountainous environment, towns tend to be very well defined in size. They don't grow too much because there's only so far they can physically grow, right? And so you tend to have these villages and towns that stay the same size for a long time, and so you'll get more towns and villages as opposed to a village going into a town going into a city. So those are all things to think about in terms of your world and your setting and your environment. So we've got that. That's weird. 1 second. Sorry. I'm a little confused because my stats say I'm offline, even though I don't appear to be offline. That's weird. Okay, sorry. All right. So we want to answer those questions. And as usual, it helps to think of a very normal answer for this and kind of a wild answer for this. How crazy can you get with geography? So I think for my Bronze Age setting, this is the one with plentiful food, small, simple magic, and the use of personal marks to mark private property, and thus popular crafting. We're going to probably have, well, the fact that you have marks implies, I don't know, the fact that you have plentiful food, that says something right there about the geography. So certainly a verdant land, a large amount of land. So I think this is going to be the land is temperate. Let's say the varies from temperate to wild. It's hard to find a spot without vegetation, and as a result, animal life. This ranges from, don't want to say domesticated, but calm forests to wild jungles. Let's say wild, savage jungles. In other words, this is a big place with a lot of land. And it can be very dangerous out there, but wherever there is danger, there's life. It's not a place, this is not a place of desolation. Desolate spots are rare. And now I'm thinking about Nausicaa, the Valley of Wind. I'm wondering if maybe the vegetation is aggressive, if they're living in an environment where plants are kind of taking over. Hey, James. So maybe there is a lot of stuff happening. Maybe there is. That's actually really interesting, where you're almost fighting to take land back from this aggressive plant life. I like that a lot. In fact, in many areas, plant life has become aggressive, swarming over and swallowing up land. Swallowing up land. Yeah. these places are downright dangerous for humans. That gives us a good adventuring location. It gives us a place to play around with, right? So I like that a lot. Okay. We'll also say the land itself is a very large continent. Very large continent, typically hilly, with a large with two large mountain ranges that cross in the center. So we're going to imagine a continent with, and maybe it's an X-shaped. So there's a, or maybe not. I think the mountain ranges typically don't work that way. So we're going to have one mountain range that goes north-south, another that goes east and west, and kind of crosses the continent and goes in the center there. And that will also allow us to have some kind of different environments in different regions of that continent. Cool. That works nicely. Okay. Setting 2, our gunpowder world. Ranching. Ore is common. Iron is extremely commonplace. So a lot of mining, which implies a lot of rocks, a lot of rocky ground. Communal property is a norm. Magic is rare, powerful. Oh yeah, and then we have familiar magic, which I really like. So we'll say, I've been thinking about this actually. I like the idea that this is an island-oriented world, i.e., the idea of a volcanic island. We're going to have a bunch of little islands that are all close to each other, or more or less connected, where you can basically, there's water between them, but the water only gets maybe 10 feet deep between the two. So there's, the world is made up of hundreds, 1,000 islands. We'll just go there. Why not? 1,000 island dressing. All right, so call it the world of 1,000 islands. That might actually be the title for this setting. Hundreds of islands cluster together, forming the land masses of the world. Some are used exclusively for mining and other industrial uses. So you can think of this as being almost like neighborhoods, where or districts of a city, where there are some that are kind of zoned for factory use, some that are kind of garden environments where people just live there and everything's imported in. It's gonna be fairly rare, but that might happen. Again, magic is rare, but I like this. This also kind of ties into this idea that we're starting to get gunpowder. We're starting to get, which implies armies and militaries with all these different little islands. It's gonna be very easy for people to fight over these little islands for control and control of stuff. Now, it also implies locomotives make no sense whatsoever. You're not going to have a locomotive going between islands unless you have some really cool technology behind that. So, that's an interesting thought. Unless we have the idea of one big central landmass and tons of islands around it. So there is, the possibility for railroads in that area. And then we can make the geography of that. Maybe that central continent is where all the mining takes place. And so that's a very sort of a big industrial zone, and people tend to not live necessarily, but they tend to farm on the islands around it. Hundreds of islands. So we're going to say the world clustered together around one small continent. That's the world. The central continent is very mineral rich and is used for mining and other industry. People generally farm and live on the islands around it. Interesting. Ranching, default food method. Lots of animals. Okay. There are vast tracts of land people generally live in large groups on shared ranches. So that's actually going against the idea of lots of little islands. So maybe instead of my idea, I don't know, maybe instead of the idea of lots of little islands, there are many but relatively few large islands. So it's sort of this fractured. So we'll say the world of 100 islands. 100 islands cluster around one small continent. I like this. This makes some sense. So again, you have this one mineral-rich island that's used, that's sort of this primary resource. But these other islands are large enough, 100, call them large islands, cluster around one small continent. And by island, I mean, we're still meaning large. We're talking, the size of Ireland or even perhaps England. So it's, though that scale of island where it's still lots of landmass. I would say maybe England is the upper limit there in terms of island size, but we want significant land masses. And again, many of them many of them will have mines. We'll have the whole range of stuff on there. We're not going to have necessarily microclimates on each individual one. Hey Daniel, yes, you're right, Earthsea. So yeah, sort of Earthsea-like. That's a great point. Which does mean you would have these, this is not unlike Earthsea. That's a great way of putting it. Thanks, Dan. All right, so that's our concept of geography, and let's mention that. Any farm live on islands around it. Although many people live on the central continent, and mining occurs on the islands. Not like Earthsea. Okay, cool. So there's the setting there. I like that. Now let's talk about settlements. Oops. And by settlement, I mean a basic place where people live. The village, basically. What we think of as a village or a community. What does that look like? And to define that, we need to figure out a few things. So one of the big things is water. Actually, just go through some of these things. Trades, and we'll say food as well, and leadership. These, I think, are the sort of the four core things. Every settlement needs to be near water. You may have heard that in ancient times people drank beer and ale all the time because there was no fresh water. This actually is not supported by actual historical evidence, especially given the fact that those historical settlements were almost always near fresh running water. Now, the water was not always, like an alpine spring. It wasn't necessarily pure drinking water in the sense we're used to, but it was always, clean, drinkable running water. People drank water historically, even up to the present day. ale and other things were used as a supplement because it would last relatively, a little time, and it was fermented, which is nice. But ale and fermented beverages don't last very long, so it does not make sense. People would, oh, well, this will last. No, it doesn't. So now wine will, but wine's different, and wine's expensive until recently. Okay, so you're gonna need to be near water, which suggests, okay, you've got coastlines, rivers, lakes, basically. Those are where your settlements are gonna be. What does that look like in your world? Then there's food. How do the people in that settlement feed themselves? Farming, ranching, input, getting food from other places because what they're doing there is willing to support that. Then there is that trade in and out of the village. In a medieval village, medieval European village, for example, most farmers, most farmers usually produced a little more than they actually consumed, and so that could go to market, or that could be used to trade or barter or sell for services and other things like services from the blacksmith, etc. And a village of a significant size would start to specialize. You'd have one person who was good at this, could train other people at that thing, let's say knitting, for example. And so you'd start getting more and more people doing that one thing in that one place. So you want to think about those things. In an agricultural area, that might be particular animals that they're good at making or good at breeding. There might be foods that they're particularly good at. In England, cheese was a big one, where every village had its own special kind of cheese that it would make. Drinks, and then also the actual produce. So, vines, lettuce, tomatoes, fruits, things from that region that are prized outside of that region. And then things they can also import in. And finally, leadership. Who decides what work gets done, basically, in a settlement? Is it a commune, which rarely works long term? Is it complete autocratic dictatorship, which also usually doesn't work long term, at least not in a pure form? Is there a council? Whatever. And so it's easy to think of, is there essentially nodal leadership, or we'll say completely democratic group leadership? Is there a single leader? Is there a group that leads? And then how is membership in that leadership group determined? So all of those things vary wildly from environment to environment, and that is tied into your geography. It's tied into property, into what people think property is and isn't. It ties into where you get your food, and it ties into your tech level, right? If you're in a mechanical age, it's a lot easier to trade things back and forth because you don't have technology that is making the production of food much easier, as you're producing a lot more food. Military policing, right? Yes, you can have a sort of an oligarchy, sort of upper crust of military that is doing that. Although that tends to be still under a particular leader. So let's go back to our first setting, our Bronze Age setting, minimal technology. This is our basically one large continent, hilly, with very aggressive plant life. And so what does a settlement look like? Well, we've agreed that food is plentiful, magic is small but controlled, and people are very aware of personal and private property. So this begs the question, if it's easy to grab food from the environment, what does a settlement look like? It's going to be a little more mobile. Perhaps this is a world of more mobile, sort of gypsy-like people who wander from area to area. Perhaps folks aren't tied down. You'll have so about half of all food is farmed or ranched. Now, ranched food can move, ranched animals can move from area to area. Farming, you kind of need to be tied down for. But then if the foliage is this aggressive, It could be that you want to move from area to area because you're kind of cultivating different spots. Let's have that idea. Let's kind of go a little crazy. Most people live. What's the word I'm looking for? They are a migrant. Most people are migrant. Most people live in caravans from, let's say, a dozen people up to, how big could you get? Hundreds. I'm trying to imagine a caravan of 1,000 people in a world like this. Certainly possible. Up to, let's say thousands. Up to thousands. Traveling from spot to spot, cultivating different crops. So we're going to imagine that you don't necessarily need to tend a crop all year. You can kind of plant something here, make sure it's growing, and then move on to somewhere else. Harvest, plant resources, plant stuff, and move on. You kind of go from one place to another, ideally preserving food from the previous spots. I like that idea. There are also habitations tied to the land, and sometimes these connect. Let's say there may be a particular area that needs long-term cultivation. So a small contingent lives here permanently while several caravans stop by on rotation, and they all share. Okay, interesting. Yeah, it totally depends on resources, exactly. All right, let's see here. We also have these areas in the world that are kind of being taken over by vegetation. So we might have some caravans travel deep into unexplored, wild territory, seeking out unusual plant life for trade. You're going to have some caravans that just go to, hey Tandem, good to see you again. You're going to have some caravans that just go to the same, 8 places every year and just cycle through that, and they're very, very straightforward. And then some that kind of strike out into these more wild places, seeking the stuff that's taken over and then bringing those back to other places to sell and trade. That makes some sense. I like that. This ties into this small but controlled magic. So many people can use simple rituals to create low-power magical effects. Anyone can cast magic to perform these rituals, though some are more powerful. It taxes the mind, which makes the mind fuzzy. So, yeah, you're not going to get people who are casting Fireball. But there are going to be a lot of these rituals and a lot of this magic around making the way safe in the wilderness, around keeping a fire going, things along those lines. Very simple things, which makes sense if you're very tied to the land this way. Cool, I like this a lot. All right, so there's that idea. Is there anything else you want to think about in terms of settlements, trades? Then leadership. So how are these structured? Hey Tandem, yes, I did discover that there was no sound coming out when I finished. Like literally, the minute I closed it down, I discovered that there was a routing issue with the audio. So sorry about that. I will hopefully be able to fix that for next time. But yes, there was some kind of weird audio thing. I did a test and it seemed to be working, but apparently it was not. Okay, so leadership. Well, I'm going to say that most caravans are led by a sole leader who answers to a council, and the council is elected. Pretty straightforward organization. You know, it's hard for a council to really make decisions, so you know, you have that. Some just use a council. Some are run by a leader. So there's a variety. You know, if you're in a caravan that's going from good to know that tandem. Weird. So you know, if you're going to the same 8 spots every year and just cycling through all this vegetation, you don't really need a powerful leader who's making, you know, firm decisions all the time. You know, a council that's going to be slower to come to decisions should be fine. But if you're striking out into the wilderness, you're probably going to want somebody who can make hard, fast decisions about things. In fact, typically the ones on very regular routes, typically the ones hunting in wild territory. All right, so there's that. Move to setting 2. Our crazy magic, love that magic idea, ranch heavy world of 100 islands. What do settlements look like? Well, we've already decided some of that. We know we have ranches. People grow up on ranches. Vast tracts of land. People generally live in large groups on shared ranches. As a result of that, what is in your bedroom is owned by you. So you have this very strong sense of personal property within your bedroom. And once you have that, when you have in your person, that is kind of you, and then that is one of the very few things that is separating you from the mass of everyone else in this group. You know, once you step out of your bedroom, everything else there more or less is shared. So we're going to imagine that kind of ranch life, and what a settlement looks like. So, settlements are like dude ranches. Settlements typically are close to large sources of water, rivers and lakes, not wells. Water, and rarely and stay for many years. Again, if you got a ranch and all these people there, if a few people move in or out, that's not going to matter that much. That's generally going to stay there because, you know, communal property tends to just stay. Food typically comes from the animals ranched there and other nearby food. It's a little weird to eat a lot of food from other places. So typically where you're living, you know, you eat locally. People just really don't. You know, you'll have delicacies from other places, but the idea that somebody would be eating, you know, Kobe beef and you know, lettuce from one place and carrots from someplace else is just kind of bizarre. You eat your local food. And we'll say and other and vegetation and vegetation and vegetables grown on the farm, fruits and vegetables. weird to eat a lot of food in other places. Okay, so that's that. So that's what that's water and food trades leadership. So because settlements tend to have relatively large numbers of people, a small settlement will have several dozen members. Yeah. Well, yeah, it doesn't feel like, yeah, so that makes sense. It's easier to specialize. So you tend to see people with unusual skills who then strike out on their own. Traveling entertainers, specialists, vets, etc. are not uncommon, and indeed about a quarter of any given settlement's population is made up of itinerant travelers who will probably leave within a year. So this is a big difference. You have these ranches that will be made up of many buildings. Not dozens of buildings, but quite a few, and a lot of people living there, multiple families. But of those people, a lot of them are, the vet because that travels from here to there, or somebody who specializes in tracking down lost animals, etc. And they'll work here for a while and then move on to somewhere else. They may even have a circuit where they go around for, and every 2 years they're in a particular ranch for a couple of months. As opposed to these caravans, which would be a little more insular, I think. You generally don't, if you leave the caravan, it's leaving permanently. People generally don't, bounce from caravan to caravan. Large dude ranches. This also means, so then we get the question of family. And this is actually a family structure. When and how do children set up their own households? All right, so once a child reaches the age of maturity and wants to start their own family, what does that look like? Does do the parents step aside and have those children take over the family farm, so the parents still live there, but those grown kids are now taking care of it, or is it expected that they'll go out and start their own farm somewhere else, which means a lot more change of property. It also gets into, again, this kind of idea of personal space. So let's see here. So we'll stick with setting 2 on this. You're going to have people living together for a long, a pretty long time in these communal spaces, but there's a lot of people coming in and out. So then the question becomes, who do you marry? Is it common to marry within the ranch? I would say adolescents tend to marry outside the ranch. It's just weird to marry someone you've lived with all your life. When children always travel with their parents, children often and travel with their parents if when those parents move to another ranch. Meaning, if I have a dependent child and I'm moving and I decide to, I have a skill I want to use somewhere else, frequently I'll bring that child with me, and that's sort of new blood in that area, and so that becomes sort of a marriageable prospect if the child's older. And then, but maybe not. I might, I might go and leave the child behind to be raised in that area, and then I might actually, bring someone back for my kid to marry. So, indeed, parents sometimes travel, leaving their children behind temporarily in search of spouses. This does not always work out well, as you can imagine. But it's one of those, again, fresh blood things. How do you keep it from getting weird, where you have the same 70 people in this ranch year in, year out? Who marries whom? Getting back to the caravans, with less of that going on. We still haven't figured out leadership for setting 2. We'll get back to that. With people in caravans and not wanting to leave the caravan, obviously, if you're in a very large caravan of 1,000 people, it's going to be fine for you to marry somebody who's, from the other side of the caravan that you've never seen. The bloodlines are going to be very different. But in a small caravan, that's going to be hard. Maybe. So, in small caravans, children. Small caravans act something like farms in terms of inheritance. Actually, we'll go even further. In a small caravan, children will either take over the caravan and marry someone they meet, marrying an outsider, or will leave to start their own caravan. In larger caravans, those inside may marry each other. So yeah, I'm still not quite sure how that's going to work, how we want that to be. There's obviously a gray area there, or what if we have like a medium-sized caravan and you have grown up with all these people, but you got to marry somebody. Like, how does that work? I think they're just going to kind of leave it. It's a common thing in a lot of societies and cultures where when you think about it logically, it doesn't seem like it would work. But ultimately, people are like, look, or people aren't like this. It just ends up being that people follow these taboos. If you live in a caravan and you grew up with everyone else, you will then look wherever you stop for somebody to fall in love with, and you'll kind of push yourself to get out of that gene pool. And even though there is no law forcing you to do so, it just ends up that way. Or maybe your parents, push you in that way, whatever. So we might just say this is one of those things that ends up being true just to avoid any sort of weird incestuous implications. All right, so let's go back to setting 2 and ask how those dude ranches are structured. It's hard with a lot of... You're going to have multiple different families all working and operating together. It might be communal. It might be basically communes. I'm thinking this might require a complicated structure. So I'm thinking the ranch operates under two forms of law, common law and leader law. Come up with a better name later. Common law applies to all, including leadership. Leader law is used. The ranch hands elect leadership, sometimes a single person, sometimes a council, who have the authority to enact, to sit in judgment, leader law, in cases where common law does not apply. In other words, the ranch will have well-defined rules on what happens when you steal, what happens when you, destroy public property, whatever. Again, remembering that a lot of things are public property. Then but then in cases where that doesn't quite fit, or where you're not quite sure what's happened, then leadership steps in to kind of handle that. But then leadership is locally elected. Leadership changes in various forms. In some ranches, yearly, sometimes upon vote, whatever. So that'll vary a lot from area to area as to exactly how all that works. And that adds some complexity to things, where who is your leader? What power exactly does that leader have in this community? Is that term coming up? What does that mean? Can someone serve over and over again, or is there a requirement that it goes from person to person? You can often have a situation where there's supposed to be a different person every time, but there are only a few people kind of qualified, and most of them are bad at it. And it's like there's really only one person, but we technically shouldn't have the same person over and over again. But maybe we should. But maybe by putting them in that situation over and over again, that will cause other problems. It's complicated. Okay, let's look back at our list. It's water, food, trades, leadership, family structure. Okay. I don't think we have to get into too much detail about how families actually live. We should nail down a little bit more the concept of children in that setting of very well-defined personal property. A man and wife live in one room, but will have trunks for personal possession. Right? So when you're married, you literally, have this one room, and those are possessions shared between the two of you, but you will also each have a chest or a trunk or a chest of drawers or something that has your personal possessions, your underwear or that kind of stuff. And those are not owned technically by your spouse. What about children? Communal property is a norm. So let's create another section here. Families live very close. Children live with in their parents' room until they reach a certain age. 8 years old. That seems about right. This is not. It's sort of an age of reason. It's an age of. It's not age of maturity. It's not age of, adulthood. It just means you've now survived, frankly, long enough, and you've now grown up enough to where, you have your own space in which to live. 8 may be too young. It might be 12. 12. It would be a little weird to grow up. Imagine the first 12 years of your life living entirely communally with your parents. I would think at some point you'd need some point at which you have your own space. But maybe not. We're going to say 12. Having your... So we'll move this down here. And obviously, bedrooms tend to be clustered for families together. So once you reach 12, you're gonna get your own bedroom, but it's gonna be close to your parents' room. Even though you got a lot of people all living in this big environment. You also have the advantage that because you have so much communal stuff, perhaps it's not uncommon for folks to shift bedrooms, right? Where you live in this room, I live in that room, but this family's expanding, so I'm gonna move my stuff down to this other room. It's a lot easier to move a single bedroom's worth of stuff than a house worth of stuff. Let's put that in. It's quite common to shuffle bedrooms as families enlarge. Your bedroom might be next to a growing family, so you'll move to another room while a 12-year-old gets your room. Okay. It's a very interesting world. There might even be hierarchies where you have a variety of different sort of room sizes, and when you're young, you get a room, but you get a small room, and then when you become an adult, you get a larger room. But we'll have to think about that. That's not necessarily guaranteed. And that might be more a cultural thing, where that's true in some areas of the world, not in others. All right, we've been going for about an hour. That will do it for this particular World Building Wednesday. We have some good ideas here. We've definitely fleshed out these societies quite a bit more. Got a good idea of these things. Again, we looked over geography and how that impacts things. Again, it hasn't had a huge impact here, but it makes it feel a little more real. And then what settlements look like. This has had a big impact on what a family unit looks like, what a standard place you live looks like. Next time, I'm going to talk about gods and religion and how to create a pantheon, particularly a pantheon that is useful in a game or in a novel, where you want to be able to invoke those gods, but that also isn't too pat. People often will create gods and they'll create a very simple matching of sort of god to concept, which isn't really how gods necessarily work in religion or in real religion, or more accurately, it's more complex than that. So we'll get into that. Sometimes you don't want to be that complex. Sometimes you want to be straightforward. But we'll kind of dive into how to handle religion and a pantheon of gods and a variety of different kinds of faiths in this world. And I think that will be a good evening's worth of material. So for those watching live, I'm going to go dark for just a few minutes and then start up again in about 5 minutes with Workshop Wednesday. So stay tuned for that. I'll be back in about 5 minutes. Otherwise, you watching this video on demand, I'll be back next week with gods.